Right, well, thanks so much, Jean-David, for that introduction. I really appreciate being here. It's a fantastic audience, and also it's great to have the morning gig because obviously I have your attention. I want to first just start off by giving you a little bit of a background about me. So my background actually is in applied maths, so mathematics, nothing to do with healthcare whatsoever. So you're going to ask this question, which is, what on earth is a mathematician doing standing on stage talking in a health-related entrepreneurial conference? And that is a long story, of which I don't have all the time to explain to you right now. But I should say that the reason why I do this research is because what I'd like to do is I'd like to try to accelerate medical research by augmenting it with what we might say is mass-scale, high-quality quantitative data. Being a mathematician, I love data. So data is my lifeblood. Numbers, having some numbers is crucial. And then the next question you're going to ask is, why do we need to do this? Why do we care about numbers in healthcare? Well, many disorders, many diseases are essentially intractable. That is, we just can't actually understand what they are and what they're about, because we simply don't know enough about them. It's as simple as that. We just don't know enough about these diseases, right? So we have somehow to address the major stumbling blocks towards understanding. And understanding in medicine is about science. It's about getting enough data that we can actually start to build theories and test them, right? So we need to be able to build theories about the disease and then test it. So my own personal motivation for this comes from the fact that, so there's a friend of mine, for example, who has Parkinson's disease, and being a mathematician, not a doctor, I have absolutely no hope of being able to help him unless I can find some way to use my skills in order to be able to do something about it. But of course, I'm not alone in this. All of you will know somebody. A very large number of you will know somebody who has, for example, Parkinson's disease. Given that there are 7 million people worldwide with Parkinson's, and given the network effects that Jean-David talked about, basically you know somebody who knows somebody who has Parkinson's, or you probably know someone who has Parkinson's yourself. So that's just to give you one example, and Parkinson's disease is one of many of these diseases that we just don't know enough about. All right. So what I'm trying to do in my research is about addressing some of the main stumbling blocks to recording and collecting quantitative data about diseases. And my particular area of research is in neurological disorders, for example. So how would we go about collecting quantitative data? Well, how have we done it in the past? The reality is that we have some well-meaning doctor who sits there. You can see this doctor here is very well-meaning. And clearly, she's an objective measure of this patient's illness, isn't she? Clearly, she's an objective measure of this patient's. Of course not. That's nonsense, right? There's an interpretive layer that lies between the disease and the observation, and that's the clinical rater. So the problem with this is that there is substantial variation in how clinical raters go about rating individuals' diseases. And it's made worse by the fact that often when you go to the clinic, what you get, of course, is you get the doctor will say to you, so how have you been over the last 6 months? And of course you, being an ultimately objective person who can clearly, objectively remember everything that happened to you in the last 6 months, give an objective answer to this objective doctor. No, that, of course, is nonsense, right? So there's this whole subjectivity involved. And that, for example, is the state of the art with Parkinson's disease. I'm not kidding. So to give you some idea, the best that we can pretty much say, given that kind of data, is you will get worse. That's kind of the best we can say with Parkinson's disease. We can get some idea about the rate at which you might get worse, but that would be the average. And a disease like Parkinson's is incredibly heterogeneous. So the disease is different for everyone. The rate of progression is different for everyone. And as yet, we just don't have the data to pin this down. So what might be a new way of collecting this data? Clearly, for a mathematician, I want, high-scale objective data. Well, one possible future that I see as being important is that you can use consumer technologies to do this. And the focus of my talk really is about trying to convince you that consumer technologies are going to become, and are just on the edge of being, devices which can provide hardcore data for clinical research to make the difference between, to accelerate our understanding of diseases like this. So let me give you a possible future scenario. Basically what you do is you download some specialized software to your smartphone, you put it in your pocket for a week or so. The software measures your behavior over that period, and it quantifies your symptoms objectively, and it sends that information to your doctor or to the researchers involved in this particular project. And I'm going to show you that this is decidedly not a fantasy, that this vision is already close to reality. So what sort of technologies have been and are currently available to do this kind of remote monitoring of health? Well, things have come an enormously long way, and just over the last few years pretty much, and this of course is mostly due to Moore's law, chip transistor density doubling every 18 months, but of course I'm downplaying things like fantastic advances in things like microelectronic mechanical systems for things like sensor devices. Cell phones starting off in the 1990s, well, I mean, what could these do? Well, they could record low-quality audio, and they could send text messages. And this is already a rather amazing thing in its own right, as I'll describe. Well, 2007 or so is when smartphones started really taking off, and are now very widespread. Well, what else can they do? Well, they have so-called inertial measurement units in them. And that means that we can actually record your movement behavior continuously, about 100 times a second. And you also have very high accuracy microphones in them, so we can collect audio data, say once every 22 microseconds, and continuously. So that gives you some idea about the power of these devices that sit in our pockets right now. And that's not all. I mean, they have GPS devices on them. And of course, yes, they can get low-quality data, and you can make audio data, and you can send text with them as well. So they pretty much subsume everything that these cell phones used to do in the 1990s. But perhaps moving on, I mean, Google Glass I put it up there. That may well be one of these kind of offshoots in evolution that doesn't go anywhere, possibly. But there you are. It's an example of a device that basically crams everything, well, pretty much everything that's in a smartphone, but into a continuously wearable package that you could have on you pretty much all the time, up to a point until somebody comes and punches you because you look like, it's kind of annoying. But 2014 really was the year in which would say that smartwatches started taking over. And smartwatches are basically now converging on smartphones. So they will have all of the things in them that a smartphone has in it. So they're going to pretty much, in my view, well, I would say it's probably fair to assume that they're going to start taking over. So that gives you some idea about, that's just some idea about where the technology is headed. So what could we actually do with this technology? So I think one of the most important things is that we could go about reducing logistical difficulties for physical visits to the clinic. So what does that mean? Well, currently, if you're involved in medical research, then you have to recruit large numbers of people. And recruitment generally means that they have to turn up to some kind of hospital. But what if they have advanced Parkinson's disease? Well, they might well be in a nursing home, so the chances of them actually turning up in your clinic are basically nil. Now, let me give you like a stark statistic here that the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research published recently, which is that upwards of 30% of all trials fail to recruit a single subject. 30% of all medical trials, and those medical trials are often funded to the tune of millions of dollars. So I'll let you figure out the waste involved in that. And also that we could do continuous symptom tracking. So currently, what we mean by getting data about someone's disease is that the person turns up to the visit, and then the next 6 months they turn up for another visit. So you get a snapshot of this imperfect data about their disease. And that is just not enough data. That's simply not enough data about someone's disease in order to be able to draw conclusions about it, scientific conclusions about it. So, but with these devices, of course, we can collect that symptom data continuously. So what I mean by that is second by second, or once every 100th of a second. So it's a massive difference in the scale of data that we can collect. And also, this means that we can actually start to scale up the size of drug trials, for example. So we can actually start to scale up the amount of data that we can collect. That's the number of people involved in that study could be orders of magnitude larger. And that's crucial to get the N in the statistics to be large enough that we can detect the kind of effects that we're looking for in treatments. That N needs to be very large, and currently it's very, very expensive, extremely expensive, to get N large enough that we can start to detect statistically sufficient effects. And also, I think that this leads on to a future where we can consider that population scale screening is actually feasible for the first time. And that means that on the basis of the smartphones that you're all carrying around with you now, given that something like 70% of the developed world carry smartphones with them, that's basically an opportunity, privacy provisos notwithstanding, to collect continuous data about people's behavior that is directly relevant to disease processes on a continuous basis. And that is an enormous opportunity that has just not existed even, say, 5 years ago. So how would we go about doing this? Well, the first thing is that this objective data that we can get from smartphones is basically like sensor data. It's this kind of raw behavioral data that really has no direct relevance to the disease until we start looking at it, until we start analyzing it. And what that means is that we've got to find ways in order to extract clinically meaningful information from it. Yeah? You aren't going to be able to go to a medical researcher and show them an accelerometry trace and tell them that this is actually something that they can understand on their terms. They've got to be able to, it's got to be converted into something that's meaningful for the science, for the medical science. But we're in this very fortunate situation that, for example, over the last 50 years or so, enormous amounts of effort has been put into this question about how do we turn raw data using tools like clinical signal processing algorithms into stuff that is directly relevant for clinical applications. And we can just basically leverage a lot of those different algorithms. And this is one of the things that I do, is get involved in this question about how can we turn raw sensor data into meaningful stuff. But we're also fortunate in that we've had enormous advances in a discipline known as machine learning. Now, many of you may be familiar with this idea. Under certain circumstances, we can pretty much demonstrate that we can map things like clinical signal processing outputs directly onto things like clinical rater scales. So this is doing what the clinical rater would do, but substituting an algorithm to do that instead. Now, we can also show that that process, and I'll give you some examples of this next, can be very highly accurate. In other words, we can very highly accurately mimic what the clinical rater would do with that kind of data themselves. So if they looked at an individual, we use clinical signal processing algorithms to turn this into measures that they would observe, and then map that onto these clinical rating scales. And these clinical rating scales are directly what would be used, for example, by the FDA to make a drug approval decision, right? So that's what I mean by hardcore clinical research. So to give you some idea about this, I'm not going to go into the detail, but here's an example of an algorithm that we've used in the past, or a set of algorithms that we've used in the past. So someone does a whole set of tests on their smartphone, They involve things like a voice test. They involve a gait test, so walking around a little bit. They involve tapping on the screen. So we've got this nice, touch screen that we can use. And they'll involve things like doing a reaction time test on the smartphone. And then what we can do is we can extract a whole range, several hundreds, possibly up to thousands of these different measures, which are these are the set of numbers that a mathematician like me lives on. These are the numbers which actually summarize the sensor data into something meaningful. And then finally, we can use objective tools like, say, random forests or support vector machines in order to make a prediction on a particular clinical scale. And the next thing you're going to ask is, how well does that actually perform? Well, let me give you an example of an algorithm or that process in action based on lab quality data. So in this experiment, we had individuals just saying "ah" into a microphone. And this was recorded in an acoustic lab. And by using this sort of methodology, we can demonstrate that you can get accuracy of greater than 90% in order to be able to distinguish people who have Parkinson's or not. And that's just based on their voice recordings, right? So, that's only one small subset of the kind of data that we can get with smartphones. Another experiment here was about doing the same thing, but measuring this data in someone's home. Because clearly, if you have, you're not going to have an acoustic lab available to do this kind of data in practice, to collect this kind of data. So how well can we do it in someone's home? Because that's going to make a big difference about the quality of the data that we can get, right? If the data is poor quality, then we'll have this problem in that the machine learning methods won't be able to get any purchase on that because they expect the data generally to be reproducible. If it's not, we have a problem. So again, subjects simply say "ah" into this microphone, and we recorded in the patient's home using a specialized monitoring device. Now, this device that I pictured here was built by Intel Corporation in around 2006, 2007. And this device, well, it's a bit bulky. It's certainly not used now, but it was shipped to 50 people's homes, and they could do these tests once per week. And the way that these tests worked is they would do things like a so-called pegboard test, which is that you can pull out these little pegs and put them on the underside of the device. And that tests dexterity, right, which is crucial in Parkinson's. And also there were little paddle tests, actually, which test their ability to do timed tapping. But we can substitute that timed tapping these days using a smartphone screen, so that gives you some idea. But this was able this allowed actually Parkinson's patients to do these tests once per week. Now, of course, that's actually quite low frequency, by comparison to what you could get with a smartphone. But still, that's orders of magnitude faster than the state-of-the-art of the information that was available at that time in 2006 in Parkinson's disease. And what we could show using this methodology that I described to you, we could show that we could get less than 10% error in actually predicting symptom severity on a standard clinical scale. Now, that's actually a much harder task than predicting whether someone has Parkinson's or not. It's also getting down to the question about how severe are their symptoms currently. And, of course, that actually will be responsive to drug treatment. So that's the kind of information that you could use to decide whether or not, you could actually decide whether or not the drug is actually having an effect on their symptoms, rather than just detecting whether they have Parkinson's or not, which is an easier task. And another experiment here is about measuring Parkinson's symptom severity using continuously worn smartphones. So this is an early pilot study that we did in 2011, 2012. So we got individuals to wear a smartphone daily for 3 months. So this is collecting continuous data. So continuous data directly from an Android phone. The phones were cheap enough that we could get them for about less than $50 each. So we could scale this up to, quite a large number of participants and do it really, really cheaply. So the subjects wore this smartphone in their pocket continuously. The software collected second-by-second behavioral data. And actually, this was released as a public data analysis competition through the website kaggle.com. And the Michael J. Fox Foundation stumped up $10,000 as a prize for the best ability to be able to predict these clinical symptom rating scales using this data. So there, the idea was that we could try to actually democratize the data analysis, because a lot of the time, with data analysis, the problem is that I can stand in front of you and tell you, yes, this is the exact algorithm that we should use, but I'm very highly tainted by my understanding of the problem and what I think it takes in order to get this kind of thing out there. So bringing in extra expertise is clearly crucial in order to be able to do things like reproducibility in science, right? So one thing for me to do it, but you have to be able to reproduce it in other labs and other places in order to show that it's essentially valid. And one team, actually the winning team, came up with a set of algorithms that were 90% accurate in detecting Parkinson's, just based on those smartphone, continuously worn smartphone data. So that's a step forward, I think. That's a big step forward, because it shows that in principle this is possible, right? It shows that we can detect the difference between those who have Parkinson's and those who don't, based on smartphones that are just worn in someone's pocket. Now, what is an advantage over the previous experiments I showed you there is that the patients need to do nothing except put the smartphone in their pocket. Right? So one of the problems that I haven't really talked about here is that there's a compliance issue, right? Which is that, well, it's called adherence issue. So you ask people to do a particular set of tests on their smartphone. They're going to be very enthusiastic about doing it. And in Parkinson's, for example, a lot of participants really want to help. But they're very quickly going to get bored with it. It's not bored with it so much as they're just going to find that it's complicated and difficult to fit in with their life. So, smartphone-based approaches to this, I think, have to move down this path of being completely non-invasive in the sense that they're done continuously. So that demonstrates the principle. Another experiment is here we're going to do the same thing, but we'll use smartphones, and we get people to do these short tests. So it's a short battery of tests that we ask participants to do 4 times daily for 2 months continuously. And we had, for those of you who are interested, we had something like 70% adherence rate to that protocol. So that's good, but that's only 2 months, right? And we'd like to be able to do that continuously, yes. So 2 months is great, but perhaps not enough yet. So in terms of tests of voice, gait, touch, and screen tapping, reaction times, etc., we could get greater than 90% accuracy in detecting Parkinson's again. So that's gives you another example. A final example here is about trying to do the same thing with low tech, right? In some sense, there's high tech, what you carry with smartphones around with you, but there's the public telephone network, which has been around since the 1920s, 1930s. So how good is the public telephone network in doing this kind of test? And of course, that's important because of the fact that us in the developed world are, privileged to be able to carry our expensive smartphones around with us. But the telephone is much more widely accessible, and probably always will be much more widely accessible, I suppose, than smartphones. So in this experiment, what we did was we were attempting to measure Parkinson's symptoms just using the telephone network alone. So subjects just said are into an automated telephone system. And we had absolutely no control over the recording conditions whatsoever. It just said, call in. And they were given instructions via this automated system. And this is available in 9 countries, so that gives you some idea about how wide the scale can be of this project. And you managed to get 17,000 recruits in less than 6 months. So that shows you also how many participants you can get if you're not asking an awful lot of each participant. You're asking to get a small amount of data from each person. Just using a protocol that they would presumably know how to do just like that, without any specific training. 2,000 or so of those participants had Parkinson's disease. And I think what this demonstrates is how to perform these kind of mass-scale, public-like trials. I suppose you could call it crowdsourced trials, but I think that's a bit of a silly name. I don't want to call it exactly that. At extremely low cost. So we could do that for less than $1,000. So it gives you an idea that something like that is ridiculously cheap if all you want to do is get this kind of behavioral data. So I'm going to just give you a rundown, a sort of snapshot of a side-by-side comparison, I think, of this sort of technology and, I suppose, the old way of doing things. So this is comparing a new way with the old way, I guess. So first of all, they're both of these sets of tests are non-invasive. So we're not talking about invasive measurements here. Secondly, we're talking about leveraging an existing infrastructure. So we don't want to try to create, it's very expensive, extremely expensive, prohibitively expensive to try to build out an infrastructure to collect this kind of data. So my attempt here is to try to do stuff that uses what we already have. And of course, that's exactly what we already have with neurologists in their clinics. So we don't have to build a whole new set of clinics or invest in training vast numbers of neurologists in order to do it the old way. And we don't have to do that with the new way either. And what we've been able to show is that to a certain point, both of these technologies are comparably accurate. I'm calling a neurologist a technology. I mean, it's a technology, but you know what I mean. But in addition, well, tests that you can do yourself are ultimately, I think, more scalable than tests that you can do that a neurologist would have to be involved in doing, simply because of the fact that if they're involved, it costs more money. That's kind of where it comes down to, yeah. And we really would like to actually do this in a way which unburdens them from the need to have to do this. Because the reality is that the vast number of people with Parkinson's disease will never get tested. They'll never get objectively tested for their symptoms. They'll never even get a clinical rater scale. Probably never not once in their entire lives, unless they happen to be recruited to a specialist trial. And of course, these kind of tests can be very non-expert, so we don't actually have to invest in the training needed to do this. And this is a crucial thing because training costs money as well, and it reduces the time and the scalability. And also, doing a test like that is high speed. I mean, when we talk about a test being high speed, we mean that an existing test, for example, doing a clinical rating test might take, say, 25 to 30 minutes. But if we can do this in 5 minutes, or we can do this at no time at all, in the sense that it can be done continuously, then clearly we can cut that delay out of the loop. And also, we can get the cost down to be very, very small. And I think getting the cost down to be small is crucial because this is the path towards scalability. Yes, towards getting these kind of tests out into the population at large, so that we can do these kind of tests cheaply and quickly. And that, I think, leads to this idea of massive scalability, which I think is the essential goal here. All right, so my time is up. I want to then just sum up what I've discussed. So what I've been able to, I hope, convince you of is the fact that we can get behavioral data and combine that with mathematical and statistical algorithms to achieve very high accuracy in quantifying and predicting symptom severity in a disease like Parkinson's. And also being able to demonstrate that this can actually work across remote devices, pretty much agnostic about the hardware. So it's trying to do something that could work across a whole range of different kinds of hardware. Because that's going to be important, because, of course, one of the huge things about planning for these kind of trials is that you can't think about the technology that's available now. You've got to think about the technology that will be available in 18 months' time, right? Because that's what's going to be widespread and available then, right? And also that the process of doing so is incredibly low cost. And I hope that you can see the benefits of doing this at extremely low cost. And finally, what I hope I've been able to convince you is that consumer technologies don't have to be confined to being devices to check Facebook on, devices to, contribute your your thoughts into the ether. I mean, they are, I think, becoming, very solid tools, solid, hardcore tools for doing clinical research in reality. And that finally, by doing so, we can accelerate what you might call data-driven medical research, which is going to play, I think, a critical role, along with, say, basic science and basic biomedical science, in addressing some of the most difficult questions that we face in treating these kind of complex, intractable disorders these days. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Do we have any question in the audience for Max?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm a patient representative.
Okay.
My name is Muriel Londres. I'm Miss Londres on Twitter. I'm asking myself if you can do a large-scale screening of population and discover, for example, new patient with Parkinson disease. I don't know if you can answer my question because you're not a doctor, but is there at the moment a good solution for them? Do they have access to drugs that can diminish their symptoms or postpone the I don't know how to say it in English, but you understood.
I know what you mean, yeah. So there's a peculiar problem in Parkinson's. Well, we don't have any treatments. So there's nothing we can do about treating the disease currently. One of the reasons why we don't have any treatments is because we don't know what causes it, right? So we don't actually know what process leads up to the development of the disease. There's some speculation that the disease actually might develop something like 20 years possibly before clinical diagnosis, right? And there's some tantalizing evidence out there starting to emerge about symptoms that may be so-called precursor symptoms before the clinical diagnosis. The trouble is, we don't actually have the technology to go about measuring at sufficient precision whether someone is actually starting to develop the early signs of the disease before clinical diagnosis. That's one of the advantages of this kind of technology, is that if it is behaviorally measurable, then it's the kind of thing that you could collect using smartphone data. That is the counter-argument to the fact that some people will say, well, if there is no treatment available, why would you even diagnose somebody? Why would you even bother to try and detect it? Now, clearly, that's a personal decision for any one individual with the disease. But I tell you that unless we collect the data, we will never know. So how could we go about collecting the data? Well, of course, we could do blood tests across the entire population continuously. And that is never going to happen. Right? So I venture to suggest that by making the technology cheap enough that we could actually contemplate screening a large number of people at very low cost, that this is one of the routes towards actually understanding what the precursor symptoms are. And I can't see an argument against that. I really can't. Yeah. Unless, there's only the privacy issues, but that comes down to individuals' decisions.
Yeah, but on your large-scale study where you had, I don't know, 7,000 participants, were they, did you told them, that they had, okay, so...
I mean, it's the basics of medical research, right? You can't do this without getting their consent.
So what happened to them? Yeah. I mean...
Well, first of all, they're anonymous, so we don't know. Secondly, we didn't get ethical approval to tell them about their disease status. Now, that's a peculiar ethical conundrum for particular individuals, whether or not you tell them. But they have to know that they would not necessarily get that information.
Okay, so that they did know.
That means that they're participating without any direct benefit to them. But that is, in a way, standard practice in medical research. However, of course, actually, in other studies, similar studies like this, people have been given the opportunity to know whether or not they have the disease. But again, that's an individual decision and can't be separated from their decision-making process about... Yeah. Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you very much.